The tension in Judge Judy's courtroom was electric. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the defendant's table, her shoulders straight, eyes focused ahead, despite the chaos erupting around her. Judge Judy Sheindlin, America's toughest TV judge, was leaning forward from her bench, her famous stern expression darker than usual. "Congresswoman Crockett?" Judge Judy's voice cut through the air like a knife. "I've been hearing about your grandstanding in Congress, and frankly, I think someone needs to teach you some respect for authority." The packed courtroom held its breath. This wasn't a normal case. This was a special episode featuring the controversial young congresswoman, and Judge Judy was clearly ready for battle. What happened next would become the most watched moment in Judge Judy's 25-year career and turn Jasmine Crockett into an even bigger political superstar. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone lean forward. "With all due respect, I think you might want to check your facts before you come for me." The audience gasped. Nobody talks back to Judge Judy, ever. But Jasmine Crockett was about to do exactly that, and her response would leave the famous judge speechless for the first time in television history. If you're ready to see how Congresswoman Crockett handled America's toughest judge, hit that notification bell because what you're about to witness will be studied in law schools for years to come. Now let's see what happened when two of the strongest women in America went head-to-head in the most explosive courtroom showdown ever recorded. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two powerhouses are and what brought them to this moment. Judge Judy Sheindlin has been America's undisputed queen of courtroom television for over 2 decades. At 81 years old, she's built an empire on being tough, no nonsense, and absolutely intolerant of what she calls foolishness. With her sharp tongue and zero-patience approach, she's made millions by cutting through lies and putting people in their place. Judge Judy came from humble beginnings in Brooklyn, worked her way through law school, and spent years as a family court judge before becoming a TV sensation. She's used to being the smartest person in the room and having the final word on everything. Her show has made her one of the highest-paid people on television, and she's never met a challenger she couldn't shut down. But here's what made Judge Judy so dangerous in this moment. She'd been watching Jasmine Crockett rise in Congress with growing irritation. As someone who built her career on respect for authority and following rules, Judge Judy saw Crockett's bold questioning of powerful figures as disrespectful grandstanding. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, represents everything that threatens Judge Judy's old-school worldview. At 42, she's a former civil rights attorney who's made her name by refusing to back down from anyone. Supreme Court justices, federal judges, or powerful politicians, she didn't get to Congress through connections or family money. She earned it by outworking and outsmarting everyone in her path. Crockett grew up understanding that respect has to be earned, not demanded. Her legal background taught her to come prepared with facts, and her experience as a black woman in politics taught her that she'd have to be twice as good to get half the credit. She's not intimidated by titles, age, or reputation. She cares about truth and justice. The stakes of this confrontation couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about a TV show. It was about two completely different philosophies of power and respect colliding in real time. Judge Judy represented the old guard. Respect authority first, ask questions later. Crockett represented the new generation. Authority must earn respect through actions, not titles. The winner of this exchange would send a message about whose approach America was ready to embrace. Would Judge Judy's experience and traditional authority triumph? Or would Crockett's preparation and principled boldness prove that a new generation of leaders was ready to take charge? The entire audience knew they were about to witness something historic. Two of the strongest, smartest women in America were about to go head-to-head, and only one would walk away with their reputation intact. But this confrontation went deeper than just two strong personalities clashing. What was really at stake here was a fundamental question about how power and authority work in America. Judge Judy had spent decades building her reputation on a simple principle: respect authority first, ask questions later. In her world, experience and age automatically commanded deference. She believed that institutions and the people who represented them deserved respect simply because of their positions. This wasn't just her TV persona, this was her worldview. For Judge Judy, Crockett's aggressive questioning of Supreme Court justices and federal judges wasn't constitutional oversight, it was disrespectful grandstanding. She saw a young woman who didn't understand her place, who needed to be taught proper respect for her elders and betters. Jasmine Crockett operated from a completely different philosophy. In her world, authority must earn respect through actions, not titles. She believed that questioning powerful figures wasn't disrespectful, it was essential. Democracy only worked when people in power were held accountable, regardless of how uncomfortable that made traditional authority figures. These weren't just different approaches to politics, these were different approaches to life itself. One represented the old guard, where hierarchy and deference maintained order. The other represented a new generation that believed truth and justice mattered more than comfort and tradition. What made this moment so explosive was that both women genuinely believed they were defending American values. Judge Judy thought she was protecting respect for institutions and proper order. Crockett thought she was protecting constitutional principles and democratic accountability. The audience could feel the weight of this philosophical collision. This wasn't just entertainment. This was a real-time demonstration of America's ongoing struggle between traditional authority and democratic accountability, between respecting institutions and holding them responsible. Both women had built their careers on being right, on never backing down, on having the final word. Judge Judy had never lost a confrontation on her show. Crockett had never been intimidated by authority figures in Congress. Something had to give. The packed courtroom represented America itself, divided between those who valued traditional respect for authority and those who demanded that authority prove itself worthy of respect. Everyone knew they were witnessing more than a TV show. They were watching a generational and philosophical battle that would define how we think about power and accountability. The confrontation began almost immediately, and from the first exchange, it was clear that neither woman intended to back down. What happened next would become a masterclass in how preparation and knowledge could triumph over intimidation and assumed authority. The confrontation began almost immediately when Judge Judy called the court to order for what was supposed to be a special episode discussing congressional ethics and public service. Congresswoman Crockett, Judge Judy began, consulting her notes with theatrical importance. I've been watching your performance in Congress, and I have to say I'm not impressed. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This was already more personal than anyone had expected. You seem to think that being loud and confrontational makes you effective. But what I see is a young woman who doesn't understand how to show proper respect to her elders and betters. Crockett's expression didn't change, but those who knew her could see the slight tightening around her eyes. Judge Judy had just made her first mistake, questioning Crockett's intelligence and respect. Your Honor, Crockett replied evenly, I'd be happy to discuss my congressional record with you. I think you might be surprised by what I've actually accomplished. But Judge Judy wasn't interested in a discussion. She was here to deliver one of her famous verbal beatdowns. Don't you, Your Honor, me in that tone, Judge Judy snapped, her voice rising. I've been practicing law since before you were born. I've seen hundreds of lawyers who think they're smarter than everyone else, and they all have one thing in common. They're usually wrong. The tension in the courtroom ratcheted up several notches. Judge Judy was clearly trying to establish dominance through age and experience. You want to talk about accomplishments? I've been on television for 25 years, making more money than most politicians could dream of, because I know how to handle people like you. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining calm but gaining an edge. Your Honor, I'm not sure what you mean by people like me. Could you clarify that? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Judy had walked into potentially problematic territory, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Judge Judy, perhaps realizing her mistake, pivoted to a different attack. What I mean is politicians who think they can come into established institutions and change everything without paying their dues. You've been in Congress for what, a few years? And you think you can lecture Supreme Court justices and federal judges. This was the moment Crockett had been waiting for. Judge Judy had just revealed that she fundamentally misunderstood what Crockett's role actually was. Your Honor, Crockett said, her voice now carrying the authority she developed through years of courtroom practice. I think there might be some confusion about how our constitutional system works. The audience could sense that something was shifting. Crockett wasn't backing down. She was positioning for a counterattack. Judge Judy, apparently thinking she was winning, decided to press harder. Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young lady. I've been interpreting law longer than you've been alive. The problem with your generation is that you think you know everything, but you don't understand respect for institutions. She pointed directly at Crockett, her voice taking on the tone that had made her famous. You want to know what I think? I think you're a grandstander who uses inflammatory rhetoric to get attention. Real lawyers handle their business quietly and professionally. What Judge Judy didn't realize was that she had just walked into a perfectly laid trap. By questioning Crockett's legal credentials and suggesting she was unprofessional, Judge Judy had opened the door for Crockett to demonstrate exactly how prepared and professional she really was. Crockett sat back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Those who had watched her dismantle opponents in congressional hearings recognized the expression immediately. Your Honor, she said, pulling out a folder that her legal team had prepared. Since you've questioned my legal credentials and my understanding of constitutional principles, I think this might be a good time to review some facts. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow, still confident in her position. What facts could you possibly have that would be relevant here? Well, Crockett said, opening her folder with deliberate care. Let's start with something you said a moment ago about respecting institutions and handling business quietly. The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone could feel that Crockett was building towards something significant. You mentioned that you've been interpreting law for decades, which is true, but I think the audience might be interested in how you've actually handled some of your most famous cases. Judge Judy's confident expression flickered for just a moment. She wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. Crockett pulled out a series of documents from her folder. Your Honor, I've taken the liberty of reviewing some of your most publicized decisions from your time as a family court judge before your television career. This was unexpected. Nobody had ever brought Judge Judy's actual judicial record into question on her own show. What are you doing? Judge Judy demanded, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm demonstrating the difference between television performance and actual legal analysis, Crockett replied calmly. Since you've questioned my qualifications, I thought it might be helpful to examine yours. The audience was riveted. This had gone far beyond a typical Judge Judy episode. This was turning into a real legal confrontation between two accomplished attorneys. Crockett held up the first document. This is from a 1987 case where you ruled against a single mother seeking child support. Your reasoning was that she should have made better choices rather than relying on the court system. Judge Judy's face was starting to flush. That case was decided correctly based on the facts presented. Perhaps, Crockett continued. But here's what's interesting. 3 years later, the appellate court overturned your decision, noting that your reasoning showed insufficient consideration of the legal standards and inappropriate personal judgment. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Judy was being fact-checked in real time, and she clearly hadn't expected it. But that's not the only case, Crockett continued, pulling out another document. In 1991, you dismissed a domestic violence protective order request, stating that the woman should try harder to work things out with her husband. That decision was also overturned on appeal. Judge Judy stood up from her bench, clearly rattled. How dare you come into my courtroom and question my judicial record? I don't care what some appellate court said years later. I know how to run a courtroom. But Crockett was just getting started. Your Honor, this actually brings up an important point. This isn't really your courtroom, is it? The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. What did you say? Judge Judy demanded. Crockett stood up, her full legal training now on display. I said this isn't really your courtroom. This is a television set. You're not actually a sitting judge anymore. You're a television personality who arbitrates disputes for entertainment purposes. The audience gasped. Someone had just explained to Judge Judy exactly what her show actually was, and she clearly didn't like it. The authority you're claiming to have over me as a congresswoman is imaginary. I'm an elected federal official. You're a retired judge who now works in television. Our roles in the actual legal and political system are quite different. Judge Judy was speechless for the first time in her television career. Someone had systematically dismantled her authority while remaining completely professional and factual. What happened next would be replayed millions of times and studied in law schools as an example of how to handle authority figures who overstep their bounds. Crockett remained standing, her voice calm but carrying the authority she'd earned through years of constitutional law practice. Your Honor, since you brought up respect for institutions, let me explain how our constitutional system actually works. She opened her folder to another set of documents, her movements deliberate and confident. As a member of Congress, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That oath requires me to provide oversight of the executive and judicial branches, including questioning Supreme Court justices about their ethics and conduct. Judge Judy tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued with the precision of a seasoned litigator. You called this grandstanding, but the Constitution specifically gives Congress the power and responsibility to investigate and oversee the other branches of government. It's called checks and balances, and it's fundamental to our democracy. Crockett pulled out a copy of the Constitution itself, holding it up for the audience to see. Article 1, Section 1 gives Congress legislative power. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to regulate courts, including the Supreme Court. When I question judicial ethics, I'm not being disrespectful. I'm doing exactly what the founders intended. The audience was completely absorbed. This wasn't just a personal confrontation anymore. It was a real-time civics lesson from someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. Your Honor, you said that I don't understand respect for institutions, but respectfully, I think you might not understand what my institutional role actually requires. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pulled out another document that would prove to be the decisive moment. You mentioned that real lawyers handle their business quietly and professionally. That's an interesting perspective, but it's not supported by legal precedent. She held up a Supreme Court case. In McGrain v. Doherty, 1927, the Supreme Court held that Congress has not only the right but the duty to investigate and expose wrongdoing in government. The court specifically said that Congress's oversight function is essential to informed lawmaking. Judge Judy was staring at Crockett with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. She clearly hadn't expected to receive a constitutional law lecture from an expert. So when I question Supreme Court justices about undisclosed gifts and ethical violations, I'm not grandstanding. I'm fulfilling my constitutional duty as defined by the Supreme Court itself. Then Crockett shifted from constitutional law to personal credentials, and her voice took on a more pointed edge. Your Honor, you questioned my legal qualifications earlier. Let me clarify something for you and the audience. She pulled out her resume. I graduated from the University of Houston Law Center. I spent over a decade as a civil rights attorney, winning cases in federal court that protected people's constitutional rights. I was elected to the Texas legislature, where I passed significant legislation. Then I was elected to Congress, where I serve on the House Judiciary Committee. The contrast with Judge Judy's television career was becoming stark. My qualifications to discuss constitutional law aren't based on television ratings or entertainment value. They're based on education, experience, and the trust of voters who sent me to Congress. What came next was delivered with surgical precision. You said I don't understand respect for institutions, Your Honor, but I think what you really mean is that you expect deference to authority figures, regardless of whether that authority is earned or appropriate. Crockett's voice remained respectful but firm. I have tremendous respect for legitimate institutional authority. I respect federal judges who follow ethics rules. I respect Supreme Court justices who demonstrate judicial temperament. I respect television personalities who stay in their lane. The implication was clear, and the audience understood it immediately. But respect for institutions doesn't mean blind obedience to people who claim authority they don't actually possess. Then Crockett delivered what would become the most quoted part of her response. You criticize my generation for thinking we know everything, but Your Honor, we don't think we know everything. We think we know enough to ask the right questions of the right people at the right time. She gestured to the courtroom around them. You built your career on holding people accountable, on demanding that they answer for their actions. How is what I do in Congress any different? The parallel was devastating. Judge Judy had spent decades grilling people on television, but when someone applied the same scrutiny to institutions she respected, she called it disrespectful. The difference is that when I ask tough questions, it's to Supreme Court justices who have lifetime tenure and make decisions affecting millions of Americans. When you ask tough questions, it's to people fighting over security deposits and fender benders. Crockett sat down, but she wasn't finished. Your Honor, you said earlier that you've been making more money than most politicians could dream of. That's probably true, but money isn't how we measure success in public service. She leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of genuine conviction. I could have stayed in private practice and made more money. I could have taken a corporate law job and made more money. But I chose public service because some things are more important than money. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Judge Judy seemed to recognize that something significant was happening. So when you question my qualifications or my methods, Your Honor, I want you to understand something. I'm not here for the money, the fame, or the television ratings. I'm here because the Constitution requires Congress to provide oversight, and I take that responsibility seriously. For perhaps the first time in her television career, Judge Judy was genuinely speechless. She sat back in her chair, looking at Crockett with an expression that mixed surprise, respect, and maybe even admiration. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all its earlier aggression. Congresswoman, that was quite a response. The admission was barely audible, but everyone in the courtroom heard it. Judge Judy, the woman who had made a career of having the last word, had just been out-argued by someone half her age. I think, Judge Judy continued slowly, I may have underestimated you. Crockett smiled slightly. Your Honor, that's been happening to me my whole career. I'm used to it. But the exchange had revealed something deeper than just a clash of personalities. It had demonstrated two fundamentally different approaches to power and authority in America. Judge Judy represented the traditional model, authority derived from age, experience, and institutional position. In her world, respect flowed upward automatically, and challenging authority was inherently disrespectful. This wasn't necessarily wrong. It was how American society had operated for generations. Crockett represented a new model, authority derived from knowledge, preparation, and constitutional responsibility. In her world, respect had to be earned through competence and ethical behavior, not inherited through position. Challenging authority wasn't disrespectful, it was essential to democracy. What made Crockett's victory so decisive wasn't that she had been confrontational or disrespectful. It was exactly the opposite. She had shown that you could challenge authority figures respectfully while still being devastatingly effective. She had been prepared, professional, and principled throughout the entire confrontation. She had also demonstrated something that resonated far beyond the courtroom, the power of constitutional knowledge in American democracy. While Judge Judy relied on television persona and assumed authority, Crockett relied on factual preparation and constitutional expertise. The confrontation had also revealed the generational divide in American leadership. Judge Judy's approach worked well in controlled television environments where she had ultimate authority and scripted scenarios. But when faced with someone who understood constitutional law and wasn't intimidated by television celebrity, her methods proved insufficient. Crockett hadn't won through attitude or aggression. She had won through superior preparation, deeper knowledge, and clearer understanding of constitutional principles. She had shown that the new generation of leaders wasn't just different stylistically, they were often better informed and more constitutionally grounded than their predecessors. The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. The courtroom erupted in applause, with people on their feet recognizing that they had witnessed something historic. This wasn't just good television. It was a masterclass in how to handle authority figures who overreach while maintaining professionalism and respect. Even Judge Judy's own staff looked impressed. They had worked with her for years and had never seen anyone handle her quite like this. They had watched countless people try to challenge Judge Judy's authority through anger, defiance, or disrespect, only to be demolished by her experience and wit. But Crockett had done something different. She had challenged Judge Judy's authority through superior knowledge and constitutional understanding. She had been respectful throughout, never raising her voice or becoming personal, but she had been absolutely devastating in her factual responses. The confrontation proved that in America, constitutional knowledge still mattered, preparation still counted, and truth still had power, especially when delivered by someone brave enough to stand up for it. What happened next would transform both women's public profiles and establish new standards for how authority challenges should be conducted in American democracy. The immediate aftermath would be unlike anything television had ever seen. The immediate aftermath of Crockett's systematic dismantling of Judge Judy's authority was unlike anything television had ever seen. As the show wrapped, the atmosphere in the studio was electric, with Judge Judy clearly shaken by the encounter and offering something she rarely gave anyone: genuine respect. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said during the closing credits, "I want to apologize. I came into this thinking I knew who you were and what you represented. I was wrong." The apology was unprecedented. Judge Judy had built her entire career on never backing down, never admitting mistakes, and always having the final word. But Crockett's response had been so thorough, so professional, and so well-researched that even Judge Judy had to acknowledge she'd been outclassed. Behind the scenes, Judge Judy's producers were already discussing how to handle the episode, knowing they had television gold while also recognizing that their star had just been upstaged in spectacular fashion. The audience members were buzzing with excitement, many recording clips on their phones, knowing they'd witnessed something that would be talked about for years. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a historic moment in television and political discourse. Judge Judy herself seemed almost relieved. For decades, she had been the authority figure that nobody could challenge. But Crockett had shown her what real authority looked like. Not intimidation or assumed power, but knowledge, preparation, and constitutional expertise. "You know," Judge Judy said quietly to Crockett as they left the set, "I've been doing this for 25 years and I've never been schooled like that. I have to respect it." Crockett's response was characteristically gracious. "Your Honor, you've had an incredible career. I just think sometimes we all need reminders about how our constitutional system actually works." The exchange had been more than a television moment. It had been a demonstration of how authority should work in a democracy. Not through intimidation or assumed power, but through knowledge, preparation, and respect for constitutional principles. Both women had emerged with their reputations enhanced. Judge Judy had shown she was secure enough to admit when she was wrong and gracious enough to acknowledge expertise when she saw it. Crockett had shown that the new generation of leaders could challenge authority respectfully while still being devastatingly effective. The confrontation had established a new standard for public discourse, showing that respect for authority and holding authority accountable weren't mutually exclusive. You could do both if you came prepared with facts and constitutional knowledge. Within minutes of filming wrapping, clips from the confrontation began spreading across social media. The show wouldn't air for weeks, but audience members were already sharing what they'd witnessed, and the internet exploded with commentary and analysis. #JasmineSchoolsJudy started trending within an hour, followed shortly by #ConstitutionalBurnout, as Twitter erupted with clips and commentary. Legal Twitter was particularly excited, with constitutional law professors and practicing attorneys thrilled to see someone who actually understood constitutional principles in action. Jasmine Crockett just gave Judge Judy a masterclass in constitutional law and professional respect, tweeted Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe. "This is required viewing for anyone who wants to understand how oversight actually works." One viral tweet read, "Judge Judy, you don't respect authority. Jasmine Crockett pulls out Constitution. Let me explain exactly how authority works in America." The memes started immediately. One showed Crockett with a stack of legal documents, captioned, "When someone tries to lecture you about law but you actually studied law." Another showed Judge Judy's surprised expression with the caption, "When the student becomes the teacher." Legal professionals across the country took notice of the exchange. The American Bar Association shared clips of Crockett's constitutional explanation with the comment, "This is why legal education matters." Law schools began reaching out to Crockett's office, requesting permission to use the confrontation as teaching material. Federal judges, speaking anonymously, expressed appreciation for Crockett's defense of congressional oversight. One told the Washington Post, "She articulated the constitutional principles better than most lawyers I see in my courtroom." The confrontation had immediate political ramifications. Democratic leadership recognized they had a star on their hands, and within days, Crockett was being invited to appear on major Sunday talk shows, not as a controversial figure, but as a constitutional expert who could articulate complex legal principles clearly. Even some Republicans grudgingly acknowledged her performance. One GOP member of the Judiciary Committee told reporters, "I disagree with her politics, but she clearly knows her constitutional law." That was impressive. Beyond politics and law, the confrontation represented something larger in American culture. For decades, Judge Judy had represented unquestioned authority, the stern elder who could shut down any challenge through experience and force of personality. Crockett's response showed a new model, respectful but informed pushback against authority that overreaches legitimate bounds. She hadn't been disrespectful or confrontational. She had simply been better prepared and more knowledgeable. Cultural commentators noted the generational and racial dynamics at play. A young black woman had just out-argued one of America's most famous authority figures, not through attitude or aggression, but through superior knowledge and preparation. "This is what it looks like when the next generation of leaders shows up prepared," wrote one columnist. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended the constitutional principles that make accountability possible. The episode became required viewing in constitutional law classes, political science courses, and leadership development programs across the country, establishing new standards for how authority challenges should be conducted in American democracy. The confrontation between Judge Judy and Jasmine Crockett taught several important lessons that resonated across American political and legal culture, establishing principles that extended far beyond entertainment television. First, preparation beats intimidation every time. Crockett's success came not from attitude or aggression, but from knowledge and preparation. She had done her homework and could back up every claim with constitutional precedent and legal authority. This demonstrated that in American democracy, expertise still matters more than celebrity or assumed authority. Second, respect goes both ways. Crockett showed that you could challenge authority respectfully while still making your point decisively. She never raised her voice, never became personal, but was devastating in her factual responses. This established a new model for how authority challenges should work in democratic discourse. Third, constitutional knowledge is unassailable. The episode highlighted how few public figures actually understand constitutional principles, making Crockett's expertise impossible to argue against. Her deep understanding of separation of powers, congressional oversight, and constitutional law gave her authority that transcended political affiliation or personal opinion. The confrontation also demonstrated what new generation leadership could look like: informed, principled, and unintimidated by traditional authority structures. Crockett represented leaders who earned respect through competence rather than inheriting it through position or seniority. Perhaps most significantly, the episode became educational gold. High school civics teachers used clips to explain separation of powers and congressional oversight. Law schools used it to show effective argumentation under pressure. Political science professors used it to demonstrate how institutional knowledge could be leveraged effectively. The episode sparked broader conversations about civic education, with many commentators noting that Crockett's ability to explain constitutional principles clearly highlighted how poorly most Americans understood their own government. This led to increased interest in constitutional education and civic literacy programs. The success of Crockett's approach inspired other young politicians to adopt similar strategies, focusing on substantive knowledge and professional preparation rather than relying on viral moments or confrontational rhetoric. It showed that intelligence and preparation could be just as engaging as conflict and controversy. The episode also changed how established figures approached confrontations with new generation leaders, making clear that underestimating them came with serious risks. Political strategists began studying the encounter as a model for how to handle authority challenges effectively. Most importantly, the confrontation established a new standard for public discourse, showing that respect for authority and holding authority accountable weren't mutually exclusive. Crockett had demonstrated that the most effective way to challenge overreach wasn't through disrespect or aggression, but through superior knowledge and unwavering professionalism. The episode proved that in America, constitutional knowledge still had power, preparation still counted, and truth could still triumph, especially when delivered by someone brave enough to stand up for democratic principles while maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. In the end, the confrontation between Judge Judy and Jasmine Crockett established a new standard for public discourse and democratic accountability. It showed that respect for authority and holding authority accountable weren't mutually exclusive principles, but essential components of how democracy should function. Crockett had demonstrated that the most effective way to challenge overreach wasn't through disrespect or aggression, but through superior knowledge and unwavering professionalism. She had turned what was supposed to be her humiliation into a teaching moment for the entire country. The episode proved that in America, constitutional knowledge still mattered, preparation still counted, and truth still had power, especially when delivered by someone brave enough to stand up for democratic principles. It established that the new generation of leaders wasn't just different stylistically, they were often better informed and more constitutionally grounded than their predecessors. Most importantly, the confrontation showed that you could challenge traditional authority while maintaining complete respect and professionalism. Crockett had created a blueprint for how democratic oversight should work: informed, principled, and unintimidated by titles or celebrity. The lessons from this encounter continue to resonate in law schools, political science classrooms, and leadership development programs across America. It remains a masterclass in how preparation, constitutional knowledge, and professional conduct can triumph over intimidation and assumed authority. What did you think of Jasmine Crockett's handling of Judge Judy? Did she strike the right balance between respect and accountability? More importantly, what can we learn from her approach about how to handle authority figures who overreach their legitimate bounds? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more moments when constitutional knowledge meets television drama. The next showdown between old guard authority and new generation leadership is always just around the corner, and you won't want to miss it.